A little girl approached a confused elderly man on the street, despite others walking past. When his grandson in a suit appeared, her innocent question made everyone gasp. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Cedar Street as Sarah adjusted her colorful backpack, its weight pressing against her shoulders. Her pink sneakers hit the concrete sidewalk in a steady rhythm. The clock on the Methodist church showed 3:15 p.m. She was right on schedule. Remember to come straight home after school. Her mom's words from breakfast echoed in her mind. Sarah had nodded over her cereal bowl that morning as her mom rushed to get ready for work, straightening her nurse's uniform. "I know, Mom. I always do. And stay aware of your surroundings," her dad had added, grabbing his car keys. "No headphones while walking, right? Right, Dad?" Now, Sarah watched a yellow butterfly land on Mrs. Peterson's rosebush. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant hum of a lawnmower and the occasional car passing by. The rows of suburban houses stretched ahead, their neat lawns and white picket fences familiar and comforting. She adjusted the straps of her backpack again, feeling the weight of her math textbook. Ms. Thompson had assigned extra homework today, and Sarah wasn't looking forward to solving all those fraction problems. A cool breeze rustled through the maple trees lining the street. Sarah noticed dark clouds gathering in the distance. The weather report had mentioned rain later, but she should make it home before then. The memory of her grandmother hit her suddenly as she passed the park where they used to feed ducks together. Last summer, before the nursing home, before Grandma started forgetting things. "Sarah, honey, have you seen my glasses?" Grandma would ask, the glasses perched right on top of her head. "They're right there, Grandma," Sarah would say, trying not to giggle. But then the forgetting got worse. Grandma would wake up at night, confused about where she was. She called Sarah's mom by the wrong name. The day she couldn't remember how to get back from the grocery store, Sarah's parents decided it was time for the nursing home. A dog barked somewhere, snapping Sarah back to the present. She was approaching the intersection of Cedar and Oak when she first saw him. An elderly man stood on the corner, wearing a beige sweater despite the warm afternoon. He turned in slow circles, his hands trembling slightly. Sarah noticed how his sweater had a small hole near the elbow, and his gray slacks looked wrinkled. "Must be around here somewhere," he muttered, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Must be." A woman in workout clothes power walked past him, earbuds firmly in place. A man checking his phone barely swerved to avoid bumping into the elderly gentleman. Sarah slowed her steps. The old man reminded her of Grandma. That day, they found her wandering 3 blocks from the grocery store, still clutching her shopping list. She glanced at her watch. 3:25 p.m. Mom wouldn't be home until 6 o'clock, and Dad worked late on Thursdays. The old man took another uncertain turn, almost stumbling off the curb. Sarah's hand tightened on her backpack strap. That's when she noticed the man in the suit. He stood half a block away, partially hidden behind a large oak tree. His dark suit looked expensive, his shoes polished to a shine. He was watching the elderly man with an intense expression Sarah couldn't quite read. A car horn blared nearby, making the old man jump. He looked around with wide, frightened eyes. "The house was here," he said to no one in particular. "I'm sure it was right here." Sarah thought about Grandma again, about how scared she must have been that day, lost and confused among familiar streets that suddenly seemed strange. The man in the suit took a step forward, then stopped, checking his watch. Sarah looked at her own watch again. 3:27 p.m. Mom's voice echoed in her head. "Come straight home after school?" The old man's hands were shaking harder now. A few raindrops hit the sidewalk, leaving dark spots on the concrete. The air felt heavy with approaching rain. Sarah stood frozen, her pink sneakers rooted to the spot. She watched another person walk past the old man without a glance. The man in the suit remained motionless behind his tree. The old man's shoulders slumped. "Helen," he called out softly. "Helen, are you there?" Sarah felt her heart squeeze. She thought about her math homework, about her mom's instructions, about the rain clouds and the strange man in the suit. Then she thought about Grandma. Taking a deep breath, Sarah adjusted her backpack one final time. The first real drops of rain began to fall as she took a step toward the old man, then another. Behind her, The church clock chimed the half-hour. Ahead, the old man turned in another slow circle, lost in a neighborhood that should have been familiar. Sarah cleared her throat. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice small but clear. "Do you need help?" The old man turned towards Sarah's voice, his pale blue eyes clouded with confusion. A raindrop rolled down his wrinkled cheek. "Help," he repeated, blinking rapidly. I seem to have lost my way." Sarah glanced at the man in the suit, who had shifted slightly behind the oak tree. She took another step closer to the elderly man, keeping her movements slow and gentle, just like she used to do with Grandma. "My name is Sarah," she said, staying a careful arm's length away. "What's your name, sir?" The old man's forehead wrinkled in concentration. "Robert," he said finally. "Robert Williams. At least, I'm quite sure that's right." His hands wouldn't stop trembling. More raindrops fell, creating a soft pattering sound on the leaves above. Sarah opened her small umbrella, the one Mom always made her carry, and held it over both of them. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Williams. Do you remember your address?" Mr. Williams reached into his sweater pocket, his movements jerky and uncertain. He pulled out a crumpled tissue, a penny, and what looked like an old receipt. "I had it written down somewhere," he muttered. "Helen always makes me carry it." A car drove past, splashing through a puddle. Mr. Williams flinched at the sound. Sarah noticed Mrs. Thompson, her next-door neighbor, watching from her porch. The woman's eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. A young black girl talking to an elderly white man in the rain. Mrs. Thompson reached for her phone. "Maybe we can walk a little?" Sarah suggested, trying to ignore the neighbor's stare. Sometimes seeing things helps people remember. Mr. Williams nodded hesitantly. Yes, that might help, though Helen tells me not to wander." They began walking slowly down Cedar Street, Sarah carefully matching her steps to Mr. Williams' shuffling pace. She kept the umbrella steadily over them both, even though it meant her left side was getting wet. "Is Helen your wife?" Sarah asked, remembering how he'd called that name earlier. "My wife, yes. 53 years this June." A smile flickered across his face. "She has beautiful red hair." "Well, used to. It's white now, but I still see the red." Sarah pulled out her phone, thinking she could call for help, but the screen remained black. She'd forgotten to charge it last night, too busy finishing her science project. The rain fell harder now. Behind them, Sarah could hear the quiet footsteps of the man in the suit, maintaining his distance, but definitely following. "Mr. Williams," she tried again. "Do you remember what your house looks like?" He stopped walking, his breath coming in short bursts. "White, with blue shutters. Helen's roses under the window." His voice trailed off. "But it's not there anymore. They must have moved it." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. She thought about the time Grandma had insisted their house had been stolen, how scared she'd looked, how real it had seemed to her. A group of teenagers passed by, huddled under their backpacks against the rain. One of them pointed and whispered something. Sarah straightened her spine, remembering what her dad always said. "Keep your head high, baby girl. You know what's right? Would you recognize the street name, maybe?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady and cheerful. Mr. Williams shook his head slowly. "Everything looks different. They've changed it all." His lower lip trembled. "Helen will be so worried." Sarah checked her watch again. 3:45 p.m. Mom would definitely be upset if she knew what Sarah was doing right now. Talking to a stranger, walking in the rain, being followed by a mysterious man in a suit. But she remembered finding Grandma's grocery list after she'd been brought home that day. It had only 3 items on it: bread, milk, and Sarah's cookies, the chocolate chip ones she always baked when Sarah visited. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Mr. Williams grabbed Sarah's free hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "I want to go home," he said, his voice small and frightened. "Please, I want to go home." Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "We'll find him, Mr. Williams. I promise we will." She heard footsteps approaching from behind, dress shoes clicking on wet concrete. The man in the suit was getting closer. Sarah's heart raced. She'd seen enough stranger danger videos at school to know this could be bad. But when she looked at Mr. Williams' frightened face, she couldn't make herself let go of his hand. "Excuse me," a deep voice called out. Sarah turned slowly, positioning herself slightly in front of Mr. Williams. The man in the suit stood about 10 feet away, his expensive shoes muddy now, his jacket dark with rain. "I couldn't help but notice you seem to be having some trouble," he said, taking another step closer. Sarah tightened her grip on both the umbrella and Mr. Williams' hand. "We're fine, thank you," she said, trying to sound older than her 7 years. The man in the suit pulled something from his pocket, a leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a hospital ID card. "My name is Dr. James Williams," he said softly, "and I believe you've found my grandfather." The rain drummed steadily on Sarah's umbrella as she looked between the two men. Mr. Williams showed no sign of recognition at the sight of his supposed grandson. Thunder cracked again, closer this time. Sarah had a decision to make. Sarah's grip tightened on Mr. Williams' hand as she studied Dr. Williams' hospital ID. The rain drummed harder on her umbrella, creating a curtain of water around them. "If you're his grandson," Sarah said, her voice barely steady. "What's his wife's name?" "Helen," Dr. Williams answered immediately. "Helen Williams. She has white hair now, but Grandpa always talks about how red it used to be." Mr. Williams stirred at this, looking at the younger man with slightly more focus. "Helen?" Sarah wasn't convinced. Lots of people heard him say that name just now. Dr. Williams took a slow step back, maintaining a respectful distance. "He lives at 1247 Maple Drive. The house has blue shutters and Helen's rose garden under the front window. There's a broken cobblestone on the front path that I keep meaning to fix." Water dripped from Sarah's umbrella as she processed this. These details hadn't been mentioned before. "They sold it," Mr. Williams suddenly said, his voice quavering. "The house. They must have sold it while I was sleeping." "No, Grandpa," Dr. Williams said gently. "The house is still there. Helen's waiting for you." A police car cruised slowly past them, the officer inside watching the scene with interest. Sarah saw Mrs. Thompson still on her porch, phone in hand. "My phone's dead," Sarah announced, pulling it out. "Call the house. If Mrs. Williams answers, I'll believe you." Dr. Williams nodded, reaching for his phone. "Smart girl." He dialed a number and put the phone on speaker. After 2 rings, a woman's voice answered. "James? Did you find him? Helen?" Mr. Williams perked up at the sound. "Robert? Oh, thank God. Robert, are you okay?" Mr. Williams reached for the phone with trembling hands. "Helen, they moved the house. I can't find it?" "No, darling, the house is right here. James will bring you home." Sarah watched Mr. Williams' face as he talked to his wife. The fear began to fade from his eyes, replaced by recognition and relief. "See?" Dr. Williams said softly to Sarah. "Thank you for looking after him." Most people just walked past. Thunder boomed overhead, making them all jump. The rain was coming down in sheets now. "We should get him home," Sarah said, still not completely letting her guard down. "But I'm staying with him until we get there." Dr. Williams smiled. "I wouldn't have it any other way. My car's just around the corner." Sarah shook her head. "We'll walk. Mr. Williams needs to see how we get there." "Like breadcrumbs," Mr. Williams murmured. "Hansel and Gretel left breadcrumbs." "That's right," Sarah said, remembering how her dad would drive Grandma around the old neighborhood, helping her reconnect memories to places. "We'll make our own breadcrumbs." They started walking, Sarah still holding Mr. Williams' hand, Dr. Williams walking slightly ahead to guide them. The rain had emptied the streets, leaving them alone with the sound of water and distant thunder. "Tell me about when you moved into your house, Mr. Williams," Sarah prompted. "Was it a long time ago?" Mr. Williams' face brightened. 1972. Helen was pregnant with James's father. The realtor thought we were crazy, buying such a big house for just the 2 of us. The maple tree in the front yard was just a sapling then, Dr. Williams added. "Yes." Helen insisted on planting it herself. Said every home needs a tree to grow with the family. Mr. Williams looked around at the wet streets with more awareness now. "We used to walk to Parker's grocery every Sunday after church. Is Parker's still there?" Sarah asked. "No, it's a CVS now," Dr. Williams answered. "But the church is the same one." "Methodist," Mr. Williams said firmly. "Helen sings in the choir." They turned onto Elm Street, then Oak. With each turn, Mr. Williams seemed to grow more oriented. His grip on Sarah's hand loosened slightly. The Anderson house, he said suddenly, pointing to a yellow Victorian. They always won the Christmas lights competition. Still do, Dr. Williams confirmed. Some things never change. Sarah's arm was getting tired from holding the umbrella, and her shoes were soaked through. She checked her watch again. 4:15 p.m. Mom would be calling the neighbors soon, wondering where she was. But Mr. Williams needed her, just like Grandma had needed someone that day by the grocery store. They turned on a Maple Drive, and Mr. Williams stopped abruptly. There, he whispered. There it is. The white house with blue shutters stood halfway down the block. Even through the rain, Sarah could see the rose bushes under the windows. A porch light glowed warmly, and a figure stood in the doorway. Helen, Mr. Williams said, his voice cracking. Sarah felt him straighten up beside her, some of the confusion falling away from his face. His hand slipped from hers as he took a step forward. But then he turned back, looking down at Sarah with clear eyes. You stayed, he said simply. When everyone else walked by, you stayed? Sarah thought about her grandmother, about getting lost and found, about the courage it takes to help and the courage it takes to accept help. Everyone needs someone sometimes, she said. The rain continued to fall, but ahead of them, the porch light beckoned, promising warmth and safety and the end of wandering. Sarah took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. It was time to bring Mr. Williams home. Thunder rolled overhead as they approached the house with blue shutters. Mrs. Williams rushed down the porch steps, her white hair catching the glow of the porch light. She wore a floral apron and comfortable slippers, looking exactly like someone's grandmother should. Robert, she called out, her voice breaking. Oh, Robert. Mr. Williams moved faster now, his steps more certain on the familiar path. Sarah noticed the broken cobblestone Dr. Williams had mentioned, tilted at an angle near the bottom of the steps. Helen, Mr. Williams said, reaching for his wife. I got lost again, didn't I? Mrs. Williams wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face against his wet sweater. You're home now. That's all that matters. Sarah stood awkwardly in the rain, her umbrella dripping. Dr. Williams touched her shoulder gently. Come inside, he said. You're soaked through? Sarah glanced at her watch, 4:30 p.m. I should call my parents. Of course. You can use my phone. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and furniture polish. Family photos lined the walls. Younger versions of Mr. and Mrs. Williams. Children growing up in school pictures. Recent shots of what must be grandchildren. Let me get you a towel, Mrs. Williams said, reluctantly letting go of her husband. Robert, go change into dry clothes. James, help your grandfather. Sarah stood dripping on the welcome mat, her pink sneakers making small puddles. She pulled out her dead phone, wishing she'd charged it last night. Mrs. Williams returned with a fluffy blue towel. Here, sweetheart. What's your name? Sarah Johnson, ma'am. I live on Cedar Street. Johnson. Mrs. Williams' eyes widened slightly. Are you Marcus and Diana's little girl? Sarah nodded, surprised. You know my parents? Diana's been my nurse at Dr. Matthews' office for the past year. Mrs. Williams smiled warmly. She talks about you all the time. The phone rang then, its sharp trill making them all jump. That'll be your mother, Mrs. Williams said, reaching for the cordless handset. Hello? Yes, Diana, she's right here. Safe and sound. Sarah could hear her mother's worried voice through the receiver. Mrs. Williams handed her the phone. Mom? Sarah Elizabeth Johnson. Where have you been? I've been calling your phone for the past hour. I'm sorry, Mom. My phone died, but I had to help Mr. Williams. He was lost. And dash, Mr. Williams? Her mom's voice changed. Robert Williams? Helen's husband? Yes. I found him on Cedar Street. He couldn't remember how to get home. A pause on the line. Stay there, baby. Dad and I are coming to get you. Dr. Williams had returned downstairs, now wearing a dry shirt, but the same suit pants. He waited until Sarah finished her call. Sarah, he said, sitting in an armchair across from her. I need to thank you properly. I just helped him find his way home. No. Dr. Williams leaned forward. You did what dozens of adults wouldn't do. You saw someone in need, and you helped, even though it must have been scary. Sarah thought about the man watching from behind the tree, how frightened she'd been at first. Why didn't you come help right away? Dr. Williams sighed. I was watching to see how he'd react to different people. When he gets lost, sometimes he becomes agitated if strangers approach him. But you, he smiled. You knew exactly how to talk to him. My grandmother had Alzheimer's, Sarah said quietly. Before she went to the nursing home, understanding crossed Dr. Williams' face. That's why you stayed with him even after I showed up. You wanted to make sure he was really safe. Mrs. Williams returned with a mug of hot chocolate, placing it in Sarah's hands. Robert's resting now. He gets tired after episodes like this. Does it happen often? Sarah asked, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm mug. More and more lately, Dr. Williams answered. We've tried in-home care, but he refuses to have strangers in the house. And the waiting list for memory care facilities is months long. James, Mrs. Williams said sharply. Not now. But Sarah understood what wasn't being said. She thought about her grandmother's progression, the forgotten names, the wandering, the nursing home. The front door opened, letting in a gust of wet air. Sarah's parents rushed in, both still in their work clothes. Sarah, her mom hugged her tight, not minding the dampness. Are you okay? I'm fine, Mom. Really? Her dad looked between Dr. Williams and Mrs. Williams. Thank you for looking after her. Looking after her? Dr. Williams stood. Sir, your daughter quite possibly saved my grandfather's life today. Sarah's dad straightened up, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. What happened? Over the next few minutes, they pieced together the afternoon's events. How Sarah had found Mr. Williams. How she'd stayed with him despite the rain and the uncertainty. How she'd made sure he was really safe before trusting his grandson. That's my girl, her dad said quietly, squeezing her shoulder. Dr. Williams cleared his throat. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, I'd like to speak with you privately for a moment. Sarah, would you mind staying with my grandmother? The adults moved into the kitchen, leaving Sarah with Mrs. Williams in the living room. The old woman reached for a photo album on the coffee table. Would you like to see some pictures? She asked. This is Robert when he was a doctor himself, before he retired. Sarah looked at the photograph of a younger Mr. Williams in a white coat, smiling confidently at the camera. No confusion in his eyes then, no trembling in his hands. He was a great doctor, Mrs. Williams said softly. Always said the most important part of medicine was kindness. She looked at Sarah. He would have been proud of what you did today. In the kitchen, Sarah could hear the murmur of adult voices, discussing something in serious tones. She sipped her hot chocolate and listened to Mrs. Williams' stories, watching the rain continue to fall outside. The broken cobblestone on the front path would need to be fixed soon, she thought, before someone tripped on it, before someone else got lost trying to find their way home. The next morning dawned clear and bright. The previous day's rain, leaving everything looking freshly washed. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, picking at her cereal while her parents talked in low voices by the coffee maker. It's a generous offer, her mom was saying. And he's right. We could use the help with college savings. I don't like taking money for doing the right thing, her dad replied, stirring his coffee. That's not what we taught her. It's not about the money, Marcus. You heard what Dr. Williams said. They need help, and Sarah has a gift with his father. Sarah pretended not to listen, but her ears caught every word. She thought about Mr. Williams' trembling hands, about Mrs. Williams' worried eyes. Her mom came to the table, still in her nursing scrubs from the night shift. Sarah, honey, how would you feel about visiting Mr. and Mrs. Williams after school sometimes? Sarah put down her spoon. Like a job? More like being a friend, her dad said, joining them. Dr. Williams thinks you might be able to help his grandfather remember things better. How? Her mom smiled. The same way you helped him yesterday. By talking about old memories, walking around the neighborhood. Just being there. Sarah thought about her grandmother again. About all the things she wished she'd asked her before the memories faded away completely. Okay, she said, but I don't want any money. Her parents exchanged looks. Baby, her dad started, but Sarah cut him off. I want Dr. Williams to fix the nursing home waiting list for Grandma instead. Get her a better room, with a window, and maybe help other people's grandparents too. Silence filled the kitchen. Her mom's eyes got shiny with tears. I'll call Dr. Williams, her dad said finally, his voice rough. Let him know the terms. That afternoon, Sarah walked to the Williams house after school. Her phone was fully charged this time, tucked safely in her backpack pocket. Mrs. Williams answered the door, wearing the same floral apron. "Sarah, come in, dear. Robert's been asking about you." Mr. Williams sat in a worn leather armchair by the window, a photo album open on his lap. He looked up as Sarah entered. "Ah," he said, smiling. "The umbrella girl. Hi, Mr. Williams. What are you looking at?" She settled on the floor next to his chair, peering at the old photographs. "Wedding pictures," he said. 1969. Helen wore her mother's veil. "You looked beautiful, Mrs. Williams," Sarah said, studying the black and white image of a young woman with flowing red hair. "Oh, call me Helen, dear. Would you like some lemonade?" As Mrs. Williams went to the kitchen, Sarah pointed to another photo. "Is this your hospital?" "County General," Mr. Williams nodded. "Worked there 40 years. Started as an intern, ended up chief of surgery." His voice grew stronger as he remembered. "Had an office on the 3rd floor, overlooking the park. Is it still there? The hospital? They tore it down 10 years ago. Built a new one across town." He frowned. "Everything changes so fast now. But some things stay the same," Sarah said quickly. "Like your house and Helen's roses and the Methodist church." Mr. Williams' face cleared. "Yes, the church. Helen still sings in the choir, you know. Every Sunday," Sarah agreed, though she wasn't sure if that was still true. Mrs. Williams returned with lemonade and cookies. "Robert, why don't you show Sarah your old doctor's bag? It's in the study." They spent the next hour exploring Mr. Williams' study, a room filled with medical books, certificates, and mementos from his career. He handled each item with care, telling Sarah stories about difficult surgeries and grateful patients. "The most important thing," he said, holding up his old stethoscope, "is to listen. Really listen. Not just to the heart, but to what people aren't saying." Sarah thought about how she'd listened yesterday, not just to his words but to his fear. "Like when someone's lost," she said. "Sometimes they don't say they're scared, but you can tell." Mr. Williams looked at her sharply, a flash of clarity in his eyes. "Yes, exactly like that." Later, they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky orange. Mrs. Williams had brought out more cookies and taken dozens of pictures for James. "Tell me about your grandmother," Mr. Williams said suddenly. Sarah blinked in surprise. "How did you know about her?" "Helen mentioned it. Said she's in Golden Meadows." "Yeah." Sarah picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. "She forgot how to get home from the grocery store one day. After that, she kept forgetting more things." Mr. Williams was quiet for a moment. "Like me? But she still remembers the important things," Sarah said quickly. "Like how much she loves us, how to make chocolate chip cookies, the lullaby she used to sing to me." "The heart remembers what the mind forgets," Mr. Williams said softly. Then he chuckled. "Listen to me, getting philosophical. Helen says I do that sometimes, when I'm having a good day. Is today a good day?" He looked at the sunset, at his wife's roses, at the broken cobblestone that his grandson still hadn't fixed. "Yes," he said, "today is a very good day." Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from her mom asking if she was ready to be picked up. "Same time tomorrow?" Mrs. Williams asked as Sarah gathered her things. "Same time," Sarah agreed. "Maybe we can walk to the park tomorrow, Mr. Williams? You can show me where the old hospital used to be." "I'd like that," he said. "And Sarah, thank you for listening." As Sarah waited for her mom's car, she watched Mr. and Mrs. Williams on their porch. He pointed at something in the distance, and she leaned close to see what he was showing her. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. Sarah thought about maps, the kind you draw on paper and the kind you carry in your heart. About how sometimes the best way to find your way home is to have someone walk beside you, listening for the things you can't say. Her mom's car pulled up, headlights cutting through the growing dusk. Tomorrow, she decided she'd bring her own photo album, share some memories of her own. After all, that's what friends did. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah fell into a new routine. Every day after school, she'd spend 2 hours with Mr. and Mrs. Williams. They explored the neighborhood together, marking important places on a large paper map Mrs. Williams had found in the garage. "The movie theater used to be here," Mr. Williams said one afternoon, pointing to what was now a coffee shop. "Took Helen to see The Graduate on our first date. She wore a blue dress. And you spilled popcorn all over it," Mrs. Williams added, laughing. Sarah drew a star on their map, writing "First date, 1968" next to it. The paper was filling up with such notes. Proposed here, 1969. James, first steps, 1975. Sunday picnics, 1980s. Today, they were trying something new. Dr. Williams had suggested walking to the park where the old hospital once stood. "Are you sure about this, Robert?" Mrs. Williams asked, adjusting his sweater collar. "We don't have to go if you're not feeling up to it." "I'm fine," Mr. Williams insisted. "Sarah's got the map, don't you, dear?" Sarah patted her backpack. "And my phone's charged, and I've got water and cookies Mrs. Williams made." They set out under a bright autumn sky. Sarah walked between them, holding Mr. Williams' hand on one side and the map in her other hand. She'd memorized the route and all the landmarks they'd marked. "Parker's Grocery was there," she said, pointing to the CVS. "You and Mrs. Williams went shopping every Sunday after church." "That's right." Mr. Williams nodded. "Helen always bought those little hard candies. What were they called?" "Butterscotch drops," Mrs. Williams said. "Still keep a jar of them in the kitchen." They turned onto Oak Street. A police car cruised by, and the officer waved. Since the day Sarah had helped Mr. Williams home, the whole neighborhood seemed to keep a protective eye on their walks. "The hospital was just ahead," Mr. Williams said suddenly, his steps slowing. "Through those trees." The park spread out before them, green and peaceful. Children played on modern equipment while parents watched from benches. Nothing remained of the building that had stood there for decades. Mr. Williams stopped walking. "Robert?" Mrs. Williams touched his arm. "We can go back?" "No." His voice was firm. "I need to see it." They found a bench near where the hospital's main entrance had been. Sarah pulled out the map and a pen. "Tell me about working here, Mr. Williams." He stared at the empty space where the building had stood. 40 years. Delivered babies who grew up to have their own babies here. Fixed broken bones and broken hearts. His hands started trembling. "But it's gone now." "All gone?" "Not gone," Sarah said quickly. "Just changed. Like how the grocery store changed, but you and Mrs. Williams still buy butterscotch drops. Like how your hair changed color, but you're still doctors." He corrected. "I was a doctor. Once a doctor, always a doctor," Mrs. Williams said firmly. "Remember what you told Sarah? About listening being the most important thing?" Mr. Williams nodded slowly. "The heart remembers what the mind forgets." "And your heart remembers being a doctor," Sarah said. "Just like my grandma's heart remembers loving me, even when she forgets my name." A child's laughter rang out from the playground. Mr. Williams watched the kids playing, his expression distant. "I delivered some of their parents," he said softly. "Right here, where we're sitting." The maternity ward was on the second floor. Sarah drew another star on the map. "What else was here?" For the next hour, Mr. Williams recalled the layout of his old workplace. The emergency room where he'd treated everything from broken arms to heart attacks. The surgical wing where he'd performed countless operations. The cafeteria where he'd proposed to Helen one rainy Tuesday morning. "You proposed in a hospital cafeteria?" Sarah asked, giggling. "Couldn't wait another minute." Mr. Williams smiled at his wife. "She was bringing me coffee after a 30-hour shift. Still the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen." Mrs. Williams wiped her eyes. "You were so tired you put the ring in my coffee cup by mistake? But you said yes anyway." "Of course I did, you wonderful fool." Sarah added another note to the map. "Coffee cup proposal. Hospital cafeteria." The afternoon sun began to sink. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her mom. "On my way to pick you up." "We should head back," Mrs. Williams said, standing. Mr. Williams remained seated, looking at the park one last time. "It's strange," he said. "All morning, I couldn't remember what I had for breakfast. But I remember every detail of this place. The smell of disinfectant, the squeak of rubber shoes on linoleum, the way the light came through the windows at dawn." "That's because these memories matter," Sarah said, helping him up. "They're part of who you are." They walked home slowly, Mr. Williams pointing out more landmarks along the way. The diner where doctors and nurses grabbed quick meals. The flower shop where he bought roses for Helen every Valentine's Day. The bus stop where he waited after late shifts. Back at the house, Dr. Williams was waiting on the porch. He stood as they approached. "How did it go?" he asked, studying his grandfather's face. "Your grandfather," Mrs. Williams said proudly, remembered every detail of that hospital, every floor, every department. And we put it all on the map, Sarah added, pulling out the paper now covered in stars and notes. Dr. Williams examined the map, his eyes widening. This is incredible. Sarah, do you realize what you've done? We just walked and talked, she shrugged. No, he said. You've created a memory map, a physical record of my grandfather's life in this neighborhood. This could help other patients with memory issues. Mr. Williams touched the map gently. It helps to see it on paper, makes it feel more real somehow. Sarah's mom pulled up in front of the house. Before leaving, Sarah carefully folded the map and handed it to Mr. Williams. For tomorrow, she said, maybe we can add more stars. More stars, he agreed. And Sarah, thank you for helping me find my way today. That's what friends do, she said, hugging him goodbye. As she walked to her mom's car, Sarah heard Dr. Williams telling his grandparents about a new memory care program he was developing at his hospital. Something about combining physical maps with personal histories. She smiled, thinking about stars on paper, marking the places where memories lived. About how sometimes the best way to remember was to share your stories with someone who wanted to listen. About how getting lost wasn't so scary when you had a friend to help you find your way back home. The morning Sarah's grandmother moved into her new room at Golden Meadows Nursing Home, the sky was a perfect cloudless blue. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching Dr. Williams direct two orderlies as they positioned the bed near the large bay window. The light's better here, he said, adjusting the curtains. And she'll be able to see the garden. Sarah's mom squeezed her hand. What do you think, baby? Should we put Grandma's chair by the window? The room was twice the size of her grandmother's old one, with soft yellow walls and enough space for family photos. A beautiful quilt from Mrs. Williams lay folded at the foot of the bed, adding a touch of home. Yeah, Sarah nodded. She likes watching birds. They'd spent the past week preparing for this move. Dr. Williams had not only arranged for a better room, but had also implemented some of the memory mapping techniques Sarah had developed with Mr. Williams. A large cork board hung on the wall, covered with photos and notes about important places in Grandma's life. Sarah had helped create it, using the same method she'd used with Mr. Williams. Your grandmother's arriving in 5 minutes, a nurse announced from the doorway. Sarah's dad looked up from where he was arranging photos on the dresser. Ready, princess? Ready. They waited in the hallway. Sarah held her latest creation, a map of her grandmother's life, marked with stars and memories, just like the one she'd made with Mr. Williams. The elevator dinged, and two nurses wheeled her grandmother out. Sarah's heart squeezed at how small she looked in the wheelchair, but her face lit up when she saw them. There's my sunshine, Grandma said, reaching for Sarah. Did you bring cookies? Even better, Sarah said, kneeling beside the wheelchair. I brought memories. Inside the room, Sarah's grandmother looked around with wide eyes. This isn't my room. It's your new room, Mom, Sarah's mom explained. A better one, with a view of the garden. The garden? Her grandmother wheeled herself to the window. Oh, look at those roses. Just like the ones I used to grow. Mrs. Williams planted those, Sarah said. She's going to teach me how to take care of them. Williams? Her grandmother turned. Robert Williams? The doctor? Sarah exchanged surprised looks with her parents. Her grandmother hadn't remembered new names in months. Yes, Mom, Sarah's mom said carefully. Do you know him? He delivered you, Diana. Back at County General. Her grandmother smiled. Such a kind man. Always had butterscotch drops in his pocket for nervous patients. Sarah pulled out her map. Look, Grandma, I marked where the old hospital was, and your house, and the school where you taught, and the church where you got married. Her grandmother studied the map, tracing the lines with a shaky finger. The bakery where your grandfather proposed. It was here, wasn't it? He brought me a chocolate cupcake with a ring on top. Really? Sarah grabbed a pen, adding another star. Tell me more about that day. For the next hour, her grandmother shared stories Sarah had never heard before. About her wedding day, about teaching first grade for 30 years, about the day Sarah was born. Dr. Williams stopped by to check on them. How's the new room, Mrs. Johnson? James Williams, her grandmother said clearly. You look just like your father when he was born. Your grandfather was so proud that day. Dr. Williams blinked in surprise. You remember that? Some things, she patted the map in her lap, just need a little help coming back. Later that afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Williams visited. They brought more butterscotch drops and stories about the old days at County General. We should make a big map, Sarah suggested. Put in the common room. Maybe other people's families could add their memories too. That's exactly what we're planning, Dr. Williams said. A community memory project. Starting right here, Sarah watched her grandmother chat with Mr. Williams about old times, her face animated and clear. The sun streamed through the bay window, warming the room and making the roses in the garden glow. You did this, her dad said quietly, hugging her from behind. You helped them find their way back to their memories. Not back, Sarah corrected. Forward. We're making new memories too. She thought about that first rainy day when she'd found Mr. Williams lost on the corner. How scared she'd been, but how she'd known she had to help. Sometimes the scariest moments led to the most beautiful changes. A week later, the community memory map hung in Golden Meadows' main hall. It started with just a few stars: the old hospital, the Williams house, Sarah's grandmother's school. But every day, new stars appeared. New stories were shared. New connections were made. And in her sunny room, Sarah's grandmother kept her own map close by, a constellation of memories to light her way home whenever she felt lost. The roses in the garden bloomed and faded, bloomed and faded. But the stories, the memories, the connections, those only grew stronger. Sarah added one final star to her grandmother's map. The day we made new friends, 2024. Because sometimes the best memories weren't in the past at all. Sometimes they were being made right now, in quiet moments between generations, in stories shared and understood, in the simple act of reaching out to help someone find their way home. 1 month after Sarah's grandmother moved into her new room, Dr. Williams called a special meeting at Golden Meadows. The common room was packed with families, residents, and staff members. Sarah sat between her parents, watching Dr. Williams set up his presentation. First, he began, I want to introduce the young lady who inspired our new memory mapping program. Sarah, would you stand up? Sarah's face grew hot as everyone turned to look at her. Her dad nudged her gently, and she stood, giving a small wave. A few weeks ago, Sarah helped my grandfather find his way home, Dr. Williams continued. But she did more than that. She showed us a new way to help people with memory issues connect with their past and present. He clicked to the first slide, showing a photo of the original map Sarah had made with Mr. Williams. By combining physical locations with personal stories, Sarah created something remarkable. A way for people to literally see their memories laid out before them. Mrs. Peterson, a resident Sarah often saw in the garden, raised her hand. Is that why there's that big map in the hallway? With all the stars? Exactly, Dr. Williams smiled. And have you noticed what's happening around that map? People nodded. Everyone had seen it. Residents stopping to share stories, families adding new stars, connections being made between different memories and different lives. My father remembers more when he looks at the map, someone called out. He found his old barber shop on there yesterday and told us stories we'd never heard before. More voices joined in. Mom recognized her church friend from 40 years ago. We found out our neighbors used to live on the same street as my aunt. Grandpa remembered where he buried my mom's time capsule. Sarah listened, amazed at how her simple idea had grown. The community map now covered an entire wall, filled with countless stars and stories. Dr. Williams held up his hand for quiet. Based on these results, we're implementing memory mapping in all our facilities. But more than that, we're starting a new program. Sarah, would you like to tell them? Sarah stood again, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger. We're calling it Stars of Memory. Kids like me can volunteer to help make memory maps with residents. Because sometimes it's easier to remember when you're sharing stories with a friend. My grandson would love that, Mrs. Peterson said. He's always asking about the old days. More families expressed interest. Dr. Williams passed out sign-up sheets while Sarah explained how the program would work. We meet twice a week, she said. We talk about places that matter to you, and we put them on your personal map. Then if you want, we can add those memories to the big map too. And it's not just about old memories, Dr. Williams added. We're making new ones too. Sarah, tell them about the garden club. Sarah grinned. Mrs. Williams is teaching us how to take care of the roses. We're planting new ones next week, one for each resident. And we're putting stars on the map to show where everyone's favorite flowers grow. The meeting continued with more details about the program. Sarah watched faces light up with interest and hope, but her attention kept drifting to the window, where she could see Mr. Williams walking in the garden with her grandmother. They stopped to smell the roses, pointing out different colors to each other. Both of them wore name tags, a new system Sarah had suggested, with not just names but little facts about each person. Mr. Williams, tag read, Dr. Robert Williams, former chief of surgery, county general. Loves butterscotch drops and Helen's roses. Her grandmother said, Margaret Johnson, retired teacher, Lincoln Elementary. Makes the best chocolate chip cookies. Sarah's grandmother. Later, after the meeting, Sarah joined them in the garden. Her grandmother was telling Mr. Williams about her first day of teaching. 1973, she said clearly. Your wife brought me flowers. Said every new teacher needed roses on their desk. Helen's always believed in flowers. Mr. Williams nodded. They help people remember the important things, like how to find your way home. Sarah asked. Exactly. He touched one of the rose bushes gently. You know, I haven't gotten lost once since we started making those maps. Sarah's grandmother patted her hand. And I remembered to save you cookies this time, in the blue tin on my dresser. Inside, families were still clustered around the community map. Someone had added a new star. First Stars of Memory Meeting, 2024. Dr. Williams found Sarah by the roses. You've started something remarkable, he said. Something that's going to help a lot of people. I just did what felt right, Sarah shrugged. Sometimes that's all it takes. He handed her a small package. This is for you. Inside was a brand new notebook, its cover decorated with stars. The first page read, Sarah's Memory Mapping Guide. Because everyone deserves help finding their way home. We'd like you to write down your methods, Dr. Williams explained. How you talk to people, how you help them remember, how you make them feel safe. We want to teach others to do what you do. Sarah thought about that first rainy day, about trust and kindness and the courage to help, about maps and memories and the stories that connected them all. Can I start now? She asked, pulling out a pen. Dr. Williams smiled. I thought you might say that. Sarah settled on a garden bench, opened her new notebook, and began to write. Step 1. Listen with your heart. Because sometimes the most important things aren't said in words. Around her, the roses bloomed in the autumn sunshine. Inside, more stars appeared on the community map. And everywhere, memories were being rediscovered, stories were being shared, and people were finding their way home, one star at a time. 1 year later, Sarah stood in front of the Golden Meadows Auditorium, adjusting the microphone. The room was filled with reporters, doctors, and families from all over the country. A banner hung above the stage, Stars of Memory, 1 year anniversary. It started with a rainy day and a lost grandfather. Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nerves. I was just trying to help someone find their way home. I didn't know it would lead to all this. She gestured to the screens behind her, showing photos of memory mapping programs in nursing homes across the country. Children and elderly residents bent over maps together, adding stars and sharing stories. We now have over 5,000 young volunteers, Dr. Williams added from his seat on stage. And the results have been remarkable. Patients show improved memory recall, reduced anxiety, and stronger social connections. In the front row, Mr. Williams sat holding his wife's hand. His lost and found tracker, a small device developed by his grandson, hung around his neck, but he hadn't needed to use it in months. The maps help, he told a reporter. But it's more than that. It's having someone to share your memories with. Someone who listens. Sarah's grandmother nodded from her seat beside them. The children remind us that every memory matters, even the ones we think we've lost. The presentation continued with video clips from different facilities. A teenage boy in Seattle helping a resident remember his fishing trips. A young girl in Florida mapping out her grandmother's favorite beach walks. A group of kids in Texas creating a digital memory map that connected nursing homes across the state. But today, Sarah said, we're announcing something new. Dr. Williams stepped up to the microphone. Thanks to funding from major healthcare organizations, we're launching the Stars of Memory Foundation. Our goal is to bring memory mapping programs to every nursing home in the country. Applause filled the auditorium. Sarah caught her parents' proud smiles in the audience. Her dad wiped his eyes, trying to be subtle about it. In our first project, Dr. Williams continued, we'll be building community memory centers, places where families can come together to create and share their memory maps. Our pilot center opens right here next month. He unveiled an architect's rendering of a beautiful building with glass walls and a garden full of roses. The sign read, the Williams Johnson Memory Center. Sarah hadn't known about this part. She looked at Dr. Williams in surprise. Named after two families who showed us that sometimes the best medicine isn't medicine at all, he explained. Sometimes it's just a child with an umbrella, willing to walk beside someone who's lost. After the presentation, people gathered in the garden for refreshments. The roses were in full bloom. Hundreds of bushes now, one for each resident. Small plaques marked each plant. Mrs. Peterson's yellow roses, Mr. Chin's red climbers, Margaret Johnson's pink tea roses. Sarah found Mr. Williams by his wife's white roses, showing his great-granddaughter how to deadhead spent blooms. You have to be gentle, he was saying. Just like with memories, handle them with care. The little girl nodded seriously, her small hands careful with the delicate petals. Her name tag read, Emily Williams, future memory keeper. Sarah, she called out, look what Grandpa Bob taught me. Sarah joined them, breathing in the sweet rose scent. He's a good teacher. Had a good teacher myself. Mr. Williams winked at her. They looked out over the garden together. Families walked among the roses, adding stars to their personal maps, sharing stories across generations. By the fountain, Sarah's grandmother was teaching a group of kids her secret chocolate chip cookie recipe. Did you ever think, Mr. Williams asked softly, that helping one lost old man would change so many lives? Sarah watched Emily carefully adding a star to her own map. First rose lesson with Grandpa Bob, 2025. I just did what you taught me, she said. The most important thing is to listen. Really listen to what people aren't saying, Mr. Williams finished. You remembered. Some things, Sarah smiled, the heart never forgets. Later, as the sun set over the garden, families gathered around the newest addition to the grounds, a massive mosaic map of the community. Made of colored glass and stone, it sparkled with thousands of golden stars, each one representing a memory shared, a connection made, a story preserved. Sarah found her original map, now framed in the entrance hall. The paper was a bit faded, the ink slightly smudged, but the stars shone as brightly as ever. She touched the first star she'd ever drawn. Found Mr. Williams, rainy day, 2024. Dr. Williams joined her, holding a familiar blue notebook, her original memory mapping guide, now published and used in nursing homes nationwide. Ready to train the new volunteers tomorrow? He asked. Sarah nodded, thinking of the 30 kids signed up to learn memory mapping. Each one would help create new stars, new connections, new ways home. You know, Dr. Williams said, they're calling you the Star Keeper now. The girl who helped people find their way back to their memories. Not back, Sarah corrected, just as she had that first day. Forward. We're still making new memories. Outside, Emily was adding another star to her map, her great-grandfather watching proudly. Mrs. Williams took pictures while Sarah's grandmother handed out cookies. Families lingered in the garden, sharing stories as fireflies began to twinkle among the roses. And somewhere, in another town, another child was reaching out to someone who was lost, ready to help them find their way home. Because that's what memory keepers did. One star at a time, one story at a time, one heart at a time, until everyone had a map to guide them home.